The radio hissed static, then nothing. Then a voice, thin and cracking. Convoy is hit. Convoy is hit. Lead vehicle disabled. I was in the second Humvee, headset pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark that lasted 2 days. My name is Nora Ellison, and that night outside Kandahar, I was 26 years old, a first lieutenant with a map case full of contingencies that were about to become useless in the space of 9 seconds. The IED had gone off under the lead vehicle. Not a direct hit, but close enough to shear the front axle and blind the driver with dust and smoke. Small arms fire opened up from a tree line to the east, a ragged, uneven rhythm that told me it wasn't a large element, just enough to pin us down while something worse arrived. Someone screamed a name over the net. Doc, Doc, we need Doc forward, and I felt the entire architecture of the mission, the one I had built on a laptop 3 days earlier, collapse in real time. There is a particular kind of silence that isn't silence at all. It's the sound of 11 men waiting for someone to tell them what happens next. I could hear it even through the gunfire, that expectant hush underneath the noise, the way you can hear your own pulse in a quiet room even when you're trying not to listen for it. My platoon sergeant's voice cut through the chaos, tight and controlled in a way that told me he was working just as hard as I was to keep the fear out of it. Ellison, talk to me. Talk to me right now. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. Not to pray, though maybe that too, somewhere underneath everything else. I closed them to see the map the way I'd built it 3 nights earlier, hunched over a laptop in a plywood operations center with a cold cup of coffee going stale beside my elbow. The terrain lines and elevation contours and the one detail almost everyone else had glossed over. A culvert crossing 200 meters south of the main route marked impassable on the official survey because it flooded every spring. It wasn't spring. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks. I had noted that discrepancy almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that earns you an eye roll in a planning session and, if you're very unlucky or very lucky, saves 11 lives 9 seconds after everything else falls apart. Redirect to the Wadi, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. South route, culvert crossing, it'll hold the weight. Get the wounded into Vehicle 3, use it as a moving shield. I want overwatch from the ridge in 90 seconds. That route's marked impassable. Boone's voice again, sharper now, testing me because that was his job in that moment, to make sure I believed what I was telling him. That survey is 11 months old. Move. There's a moment in combat when a plan either holds or it doesn't, and everyone around you can feel which way it's going to break before the outcome is even certain. The way you can feel a wave start to curl before it actually breaks over you. I felt this one hold. I felt it the way you feel a key finally turn in a stubborn lock, that small give in the mechanism before the whole thing swings open. The Rangers moved. The wounded man, a 20-year-old specialist named Danny Reyes, who I would visit in a hospital bed in Landstuhl 3 weeks later, made it into the moving vehicle. His platoon sergeant's hands pressed hard against a wound in his thigh that was bleeding faster than any of us wanted to admit out loud. The overwatch element crested the ridge at 94 seconds, close enough that the shooters in the tree line broke contact rather than risk being flanked from higher ground. Every man came home that night. It was in the debrief tent afterward, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, dust still gritty between everyone's teeth, that Sergeant First Class Boone leaned back in his folding chair until it groaned under his weight and said, to no one and everyone at once, she rebuilt the whole board in 9 seconds. Whole damn board. He looked at me with something between exhaustion and reverence, the particular look of a man recalibrating an opinion he'd been carrying for months. You're not an intel officer, Ellison. You're an architect. The name stuck the way names do in units that live and die by shorthand. Not because I'd killed anyone, not because I'd carried a rifle into that tree line myself, but because when the plan we'd trained on for 6 weeks turned to dust in the space of a heartbeat, I built a new one out of nothing but a bad map in 9 seconds, and it held. That, more than any medal that would eventually follow, was the thing I understood. Sitting in that tent with my hands finally starting to shake, now that no one needed them steady anymore. It was the thing I would carry across 2 more deployments, and the thing that would follow me home to a Legion Hall in Ohio years later, whispered by a man who had no idea it was about to detonate an entire family's silence. The Legion Hall smelled the way it always did in late summer, fried chicken floor wax and the particular mustiness of a building that had hosted 50 years of the same kind of gathering. Church suppers and homecomings and funerals, all leaving their residue behind in the same wooden beams. Folding tables lined the walls, covered in pies that were sweating faintly in the heat, and ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, doing more to stir the humidity than actually cool it. Somewhere near the back, a table of pictures sweated rings onto a paper tablecloth, and kids darted between the legs of veterans in pressed khaki, chasing each other with the particular fearlessness of children who have never once doubted they belong somewhere. I had mailed my father an invitation 2 weeks earlier, the same way I did every year, a habit I'd never quite managed to break even after a decade of the same silence in return. He never replied. I came anyway because some part of me still hadn't given up on the idea that showing up again and again year after year might eventually count for something, might eventually wear down whatever it was in him that refused to see me. My father, Colonel Walton Ellison, United States Army retired, rose to the small stage at the front of the hall the way he always did, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once doubted that a room would fall silent for him. As post commander, he'd earned that certainty honestly over more than a decade of running this Legion post like his last command, organizing the color guards and the scholarship fund and the Memorial Day ceremonies with the same rigid precision he'd once applied to soldiers under his command. He didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. Command had settled into him the way sediment settles into a riverbed over time, permanent, load-bearing, impossible to separate from the ground beneath it. My daughter has done nothing but disappoint me. The words landed the way they always did, without inflection, without heat, which somehow made them worse than shouting ever could have. A fork clinked against a plate and went still. Conversations that had been humming along the folding tables died mid-sentence. Every head in that hall turned toward me, and I felt the floor tilt the way it had tilted 100 times before in that same building at that same podium under that same sentence, delivered in that same flat, unhurried voice. My face didn't move. It had learned a long time ago not to, but something behind my ribs caved in, quietly, the way it always did, no matter how many times I told myself it wouldn't this time. He turned then and rested a heavy hand on the shoulder of the young man standing beside him. Broad-shouldered, dress uniform pressed to a knife's edge, the posture of someone who had spent years being told to stand up straighter than he thought possible and had finally believed it. "This is the young man I've had the honor of mentoring," my father said, and something in his voice warmed for the first time all evening, warmed in a way it never once had for me. Sergeant Eli Navarro, 75th Ranger Regiment, came through this post looking for a little guidance after he got out, and I'll tell you, it's been the privilege of my retirement. The son I never had. A murmur of approval moved through the room, the particular sound of a crowd deciding collectively and almost instinctively where its admiration belongs. I watched Eli's shoulders square under the weight of that praise, watched the room's respect settle onto him like something warm and borrowed. Then his eyes found mine across the hall. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. His jaw went slack, and, in a voice that was meant to be quiet, meant only for the men standing near him, but carried anyway the way certain words always do when they're heavy enough to travel on their own weight, he said, "The architect." The hall didn't understand the words, but it understood their weight instantly, the way a room understands thunder before it understands the storm. You could feel it ripple outward, confusion and curiosity colliding with something else, something closer to alarm. A few of the older veterans shifted in their folding chairs. My father's easy authority flickered, just for a second. A hairline crack in a foundation he'd poured decades ago and never once thought to inspect. "Excuse me?" he said, and for the first time that evening there was an edge of uncertainty under the command in his voice. Eli didn't answer him. He was still looking at me, and something in his expression had shifted from confusion into something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of a man realizing all at once that two separate stories he'd been carrying in his head for years actually belonged to the same person. I stood at the back of that hall in the town where I'd been told my entire childhood that I was a disappointment simply for having been born the wrong sex, and I understood with a kind of quiet certainty that the story I had spent 8 years keeping in the dark was about to break into the light, whether I was ready for it or not. The house I grew up in was small and wood-framed, set back from a gravel road on the edge of town, and it always smelled like black coffee and boot polish. That was my father's smell. Discipline brewed into the walls of that place the way damp gets into old lumber, permanent and impossible to fully scrub out no matter how many windows you opened in the summer. From the time I was 8 years old, he lined me up in the kitchen the way he'd once lined up privates on their first day of formation, heels together, shoulders back, eyes locked forward. Position of attention, he'd say, and he'd watch me until my eyelashes burned from the effort of not blinking, until my arms ached from holding themselves rigid at my sides. My bedroom got inspected every Saturday morning like it was a barracks he was walking through on White Glove Day, his footsteps slow and deliberate across the floorboards, sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a coin off the surface, shoes lined up in perfect formation, toes even, laces tucked out of sight. If he found dust on the windowsill, I cleaned until the rag came away black, and even then sometimes he'd find something else to correct, some infinitesimal flaw that only he seemed capable of seeing. When I brought home a ribbon from a track meet or aced a chemistry exam, I'd stayed up 3 nights studying for under a flashlight after he thought I'd gone to sleep. His response never varied. Don't get smug. The truth, plain and cruel in the way only truth spoken by parents can be, was simpler than any of that. In his eyes, the failure had already happened the day I was born. He'd wanted a son. He got me, and every day afterward was just further proof, in his mind, of a disappointment I'd apparently embodied since my very first breath in that hospital room. My mother carried the softness he refused to show and carried it the way some people carry water across a long distance without spilling a drop, carefully, patiently, never drawing attention to the effort it cost her. Nora Ellison had a voice like a hand pressed flat against her back, in the dark, steady and warm, and she used to slip folded slips of paper into my lunch bag before school lines from Dickinson from Frost. Reminders that there were other kinds of strength in the world, besides the kind my father recognized and measured and found me lacking in. "You'll fly," she told me once, quietly, on the back porch, when he wasn't listening from inside. "I don't know where yet, sweetheart, but you will. I've always known it." There was a night, I must have been around 12, when I woke to raised voices downstairs, my mother's voice unusually sharp for once, cutting through the floorboards. I crept to the top of the stairs and sat in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, listening. "She is not a disappointment, Walton," my mother said, her voice trembling with something I'd never heard in it before, somewhere between fear and fury. "She is 12 years old, and she is trying." My father's answer was quiet. Quieter than his usual commands, which somehow made it worse. "Trying isn't the same as succeeding, Corinne. I won't lie to her about that." I sat on those stairs a long time after the voices stopped, my knees damp with a kind of crying I'd learned, even then, to do without sound. It was the only time I ever heard her raise her voice on my behalf. And I never told either of them I'd been listening. When I was 17, I filled out my application to West Point in the evenings, alone at the kitchen table after he'd gone to bed, working through the essay questions by the light of a single lamp. I left it there one night, the ink still faintly damp, too nervous to hand it to him directly, telling myself I'd explain it to him in the morning when I could find the right words. He found it first. Without a word, without even the courtesy of a lecture this time, he tore it in half, then in quarters. Then in smaller still, until the pieces scattered across the linoleum like fallen leaves in October. He swept them into the trash can by the back door and walked out of the room the way he might correct an error in formation, brisk, final, already moving on to whatever task came next, as though he'd simply tidied something that had been left out of place. But my mother had made a copy 3 days earlier, some instinct telling her to, on the library's photocopier one Tuesday afternoon while I was still at school. Quietly behind his back, she mailed it in herself, walking the extra 4 blocks to the post office rather than using the mailbox at the end of our own driveway, where he might notice the outgoing flag raised. Months later, long after I'd stopped hoping and had started, quietly, to grieve the version of my future I thought I'd lost, a thick envelope arrived in our mailbox. I opened it alone in my room, in the dark, clutching the letter to my chest like it might disappear if I loosened my grip even slightly. My dream hadn't survived because of him. It survived because of her, because of a photocopier and a 4-block walk and a woman who understood, better than anyone else in my life ever would, exactly what I was capable of becoming. West Point stripped away every illusion I still had left by the end of the first month. Mornings smelled like chlorine from the pool and cut grass from the parade field. Nights smelled like sweat gun oil and the particular metallic tang of a barracks full of exhausted 18-year-olds who had all arrived believing in one way or another that they were exceptional and were all in the slow, humbling process of learning otherwise. My hair got cut short within the first week. My voice got trained into 2 acceptable answers, delivered instantly and without hesitation. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Precision there wasn't a virtue you cultivated for its own sake. It was survival, plain and simple. The difference between blending into formation and standing out for the wrong reasons. I commissioned into military intelligence not because I lacked the physical grit for combat arms. I'd run marathons that plenty of the men in my company couldn't finish, but because I discovered somewhere in those 4 years that my particular gift wasn't raw strength, it was pattern. I could hear what most people missed entirely, the shift in a voice over a radio net that meant something had gone wrong before anyone said so directly, the half-second of hesitation before someone told a lie, the silence that warned louder than any sound ever could. My first assignment sent me through the Military Intelligence Basic Officer course at Fort Huachuca, all sand and heat and endless briefing rooms, then jump school at Fort Benning. 3 weeks of static line drops that left bruises up both thighs and a healthy respect for gravity, and finally an assignment I hadn't fully expected when I'd signed my commissioning papers. Direct support to a Ranger Battalion. It's a real designation, though most people outside the Army have never heard of it, and I'd stopped being surprised by then at how many people assumed I'd simply been assigned somewhere safe and forgettable. A direct support officer isn't attached to a line unit the way a headquarters staffer is, filing paperwork 3 buildings away from where the actual work happens. We deploy with the operators. We live in their camps, eat the same reconstituted meals, endure the same dust storms. We brief them before every mission and debrief them after, and when the plan on paper meets the reality on the ground, and the two don't match, which happens more often than anyone likes to admit. We're the ones who have to close that gap in real time, usually with worse information than we'd like and considerably less time than we need. I wasn't there to prove I could run with a rucksack as fast as the men around me, though at Benning I ran anyway every morning, not to be one of them exactly, but to prove I could keep pace, to earn the small wordless nods that meant more to me than any commendation. Respect in that world doesn't arrive because you ask for it, or because some regulation says it's technically owed to you. It arrives slowly, grudgingly, sometimes only after months of quiet observation, because your plans hold when the situation goes sideways, because when chaos breaks loose, your contingencies are the ones still standing when the dust finally settles and everyone starts counting heads. I earned mine 1 deployment at a time, first as a 2nd lieutenant. Nobody trusted with anything more sensitive than convoy schedules and supply manifests. Then gradually, as someone who's read of a target package was worth interrupting a briefing to hear. By the time of that convoy outside Kandahar, I'd made captain. By the night in the Legion Hall years later, standing at the back of a room that had never once made space for me, I was a major, and I'd carried the name Boone gave me through 2 more deployments. Through a Bronze Star with a Valor device I rarely mention even to close friends, and eventually through a Silver Star recommendation that made its slow, bureaucratic way up a chain of command that took the better part of a year to finally approve. The first letters I mailed home carried the dust of foreign soil and the salt sting of bases half a world away, folded carefully into envelopes I addressed in my neatest handwriting, as though penmanship might somehow soften whatever silence waited on the other end. Inside one envelope early on, I slicked a photograph of myself in uniform, the bars on my collar, still new and unscratched my face. Too young, I thought later, looking back at it, for the weight it was already learning to carry. Weeks afterward, the letter came back, unopened. The paper creased from its round trip across an ocean and back, but untouched by his hands, the seal still intact, as though he'd held it at arm's length the entire time it sat on our kitchen counter and decided, without ever breaking that seal, that whatever was inside didn't concern him. Back home, whenever anyone asked my father about me at the hardware store or after church, he'd shift the conversation to weather, to crops, to anything else at all, as though the mention of my name were a minor inconvenience he'd rather not be troubled with in public. He let people believe I was tucked away behind some desk somewhere, shuffling papers nobody would ever read, filing reports that vanished into some forgotten cabinet. The truth was harder than that, and sharper, and he made certain nobody in that town ever learned it from him. My mother was the only line that stayed alive across all that distance. She called once a week, same day, same hour, her voice soft over connections that crackled and dropped every few sentences, sometimes cutting out entirely mid-word before crackling back to life. She never asked about missions. Never wanted the kind of details I couldn't have given her anyway, security classifications aside. Instead, she asked, "Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Do you have somewhere to pray, even if it's just a corner of a tent with a candle?" It was her way of keeping me tethered across however many thousand miles separated us, her voice a small, steady thread I could follow back towards something like home. Then cancer hollowed her out quietly over 11 months while I was on my second appointment and couldn't get emergency leave approved until the final week, a delay that still sits in my chest like a stone I've never quite managed to set down. At the funeral, the small church was heavy with lilies and the particular hush that settles over people who've run out of things to say to each other. My father stood near the window the entire service, watching the parking lot instead of the casket, folding and refolding the funeral program until the paper frayed soft at the edges, his knuckles pale around it. He didn't look at me. He didn't touch my hand, not once, not even when I stood directly beside him at the graveside. His silence said more than any words could have, and even in the presence of the one person who might have finally forced him to close the distance between us, he chose, again, not to. Later, as neighbors murmured their condolences in the church hall over paper cups of weak coffee, an old veteran leaned close to me and said quietly, almost conspiratorially, "They call you the architect over there, don't they? My nephew served with a unit near yours. Said your name like it meant something." The words drifted across the small space between us. My father heard them. I watched him hear them. Watched something flicker behind his eyes. Then he stiffened and turned his head deliberately away, choosing once more, even on the day we buried the only person who had ever truly seen either of us clearly, to ignore what was standing directly in front of him. In that moment, I understood the split that had come to define my entire adult life. Out there, in dust and static and gunfire, my name was spoken with something close to reverence, passed between strangers like a small, hard-won currency. At home, I remained only what he had decided years ago in a hospital room before I could even hold my own head up, that I would always be a disappointment. Nothing I built, nothing I held together under fire had ever been enough to move that verdict a single inch. The mission that gave me my name happened 11 months into my first Kandahar rotation, and it happened almost by accident, the way most defining moments in a life tend to arrive sideways uninvited, indifferent to whether you feel ready for them. We were escorting a resupply convoy through a corridor that intelligence had rated low risk that week 3 armored vehicles, 11 Rangers and me. Riding second vehicle with a laptop bag full of contingency routes I'd built the week before and genuinely hadn't expected to need. It was the kind of routine run that made junior officers complacent and senior officers nervous, precisely because everyone had done it a dozen times without incident. The IED detonated under the lead vehicle at 2,414 hours. Not a direct hit, thank God, but close enough to disable the front axle and fill the cabin with smoke and dust so thick the driver couldn't see his own hands in front of his face, let alone the road ahead. Small arms fire opened from a tree line roughly 200 meters to the east almost immediately after, timed to catch us while we were still disoriented from the blast. Not a large element, I could tell that immediately from the rhythm of it, uneven, undisciplined. Probably 4 or 5 shooters using the disabled vehicle as bait to hold us in place for something worse still moving into position, somewhere out of sight. Someone was screaming for the medic over the net, voice cracking with an urgency that cut straight through the noise of gunfire and diesel engines. Specialist Danny Reyes, 20 years old, hit in the leg, bleeding out faster than anyone wanted to say out loud over an open channel. I felt the entire mission plan, 3 days of careful, methodical work, collapse in the space of maybe 4 seconds, the neat lines of my briefing slides dissolving into something closer to static. And underneath that collapse, something else surfaced, a different map entirely, the one I'd built almost as an afterthought during those same 3 days, marking a dry wadi crossing to the south that the official route survey listed as impassable because of spring flooding. It wasn't spring. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks. The ground beneath that culvert would hold the weight of 3 armored vehicles. I was almost certain of it, and almost certain would have to be good enough. Redirect through the wadi, I said into the radio, and I made myself say it slowly, evenly, the way you talk someone down off a ledge. Because panic in my voice would have become panic in 11 other people within seconds, would have spread through that convoy faster than the gunfire itself. South route, culvert crossing. Get Reyes into Vehicle 3. Use it as a moving shield toward the crossing. I won't overwatch on the ridge in 90 seconds. That route's marked impassable, ma'am. Boone's voice, tight. Testing the plan the way he was supposed to, the way any good NCO tests an officer's judgment in the half second before committing 11 lives to it. That survey is 11 months old. Move. There's a specific feeling one I've never fully been able to describe to anyone who hasn't lived through it when a plan either catches or it doesn't. And you can feel which way it's breaking before the outcome is fully certain. A kind of physical premonition that settles somewhere between your ribs. I felt this one catch. The vehicles moved, engines straining against the loose gravel of the wadi bed. Reyes made it into the shielded Humvee, his platoon sergeant's hands pressed hard against the wound in his thigh the entire way, counting seconds out loud to keep them both calm. The Overwatch team crested the ridge at 94 seconds, close enough that the shooters in the tree line broke contact rather than risk being flanked from higher ground with better sight lines than their own. Every single man made it out that night. Reyes kept his leg, and 3 weeks later, in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, with his mother sitting in a plastic chair beside him, he told me it had been the longest 94 seconds of his entire life. And then, quietly, he thanked me for making them shorter than they might have been. In the debrief tent afterwards, Sergeant First Class Boone leaned back in a folding chair that groaned audibly under his weight, dust still caked into the creases of his face and the folds of his uniform, and said, mostly to himself, staring at the map still spread across the table between us, "She rebuilt the whole board in 9 seconds flat. Whole damn board." He looked at me the way you look at something you're recalibrating your understanding of in real time, some quiet reassessment happening behind his eyes. You're not an intel officer, Ellison, you're an architect. It stuck the way names stick in units that live by shorthand and hard-won reputation. Passed from soldier to soldier faster than any official record could travel, not because I'd fired a weapon that night, not because I'd been the one crawling toward the tree line with a rifle in my hands, because when the careful plan we'd trained on for weeks fell apart in 4 seconds flat, I built a new one out of a bad map and 9 seconds of clear thinking, and it held long enough to bring everyone home alive. That more than any medal that eventually followed months later was the thing that mattered, sitting in that buzzing fluorescent tent with my hands finally shaking now that nobody needed them steady anymore, now that the only job left was to feel belatedly exactly how frightened I had actually been. The recommendation for the Silver Star took the better part of a year to work its way through the approval chain, passed from desk to desk, signature to signature, the way these things always do. When it finally came through, my battalion commander pinned it on personally in a small ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes, and Command Sergeant Major Boone, the same man who'd given me my name in that debrief tent months earlier, stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed, nodding once slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already known for a long time and was simply glad the paperwork had finally caught up to. After years away, 3 deployments in total, Kandahar, then a second rotation to a different province, then finally a stint in Iraq that felt almost quiet by comparison, I drove back into the Ohio Valley where I'd grown up. The Legion Hall had been dressed for its annual ceremony the way it always was. Flags hung high along the rafters, tables draped in white cloth, pies lined in neat rows beside pitchers of sweating lemonade that someone had set out too early in the afternoon heat. I'd mailed my father an invitation, and he hadn't replied, the same pattern repeating itself for what felt like the 100th time, and I'd come anyway because I still hadn't learned, apparently, how to stop hoping that this time might be different. He walked the stage in the same worn blazer he'd worn for a decade of these ceremonies, as though the hall still belonged to him the way it always had, the way it probably always would in the eyes of half the people sitting in those folding chairs. He gripped the microphone and introduced Eli Navarro, a young ranger sergeant, his hand resting firm and proud on the younger man's shoulder, in a gesture I recognized instantly, though it had never once in my entire life been extended toward me. "The son I never had," he said, and pride swelled audibly in his voice, the way it never had for me, not once, not even after the Bronze Star, not even after Landstuhl. Then he turned toward me and cut me down with the same words he'd used my entire life. delivered with the same flat, practiced certainty. My daughter has done nothing but disappoint me. Eli's head snapped toward me. I watched his face pale, watched some internal calculation complete itself behind his eyes. His whisper carried further than he meant it to. The architect. The entire room heard it this time. My father chuckled, an unconvincing sound that didn't quite reach his eyes, and tried to recover the moment the way he'd recovered 1,000 moments before. She pushes papers, nothing more. He waited for laughter. None came. The silence in that hall grew heavier by the second, thick enough to feel pressing against your skin like humidity before a storm. Eyes shifted from him to me and back again. Doubt spread like water finding a crack in a foundation that had stood unquestioned for far too long. For the first time in that building, in my entire lifetime of standing in it, the room wasn't entirely his anymore. A side door opened, and Captain Simone Vasquez walked in, still in her service uniform, a manila folder tucked under one arm. She'd driven 4 hours after I'd called her the night before, half apologetic for asking, and she crossed the hall without hurry, the calm procedural walk of a JAG officer who has learned over the course of a career. That in rooms like this credibility comes from paper, not from volume. Eli drew himself upright, some old instinct of discipline squaring his shoulders even in civilian clothes. "With respect, sir," he said to my father, his voice steady now, gathering strength as he spoke. "She doesn't push papers. She saved my platoon." He told them about the convoy, the IED, the Wadi crossing nobody thought would hold, Reyes bleeding out in the back of a moving Humvee, while a 20-year-old kid counted seconds out loud to keep from panicking. Veterans nodded along the rows of folding chairs, some of them closing their eyes briefly, recognizing the shape of the story even if they'd never heard these specific details before. A younger man near the back stared, wide-eyed, and I heard a boy lean into his father's side and whisper, "She's real." The words spreading through the hall like fire through dry grass in August. Simone stepped forward and opened the folder. "For the record," she said, her voice carrying easily in the stillness, trained by years of courtrooms to fill a silent room without straining, Major Ellison's Silver Star citation is a matter of official Army record. I brought a certified copy if anyone would like to see it. She held it up, not for my father, but for the room, turning slowly so that everyone could see the seal on the document catch the overhead light. A veteran near the front cleared his throat, stood, and reached for the folder with both hands like it was something fragile, something that deserved to be handled carefully. A veteran near the back pressed a hand to his chest and rose from his chair. Then another stood. Then more, one after another, not clapping, not cheering, just standing silent and solemn, a gesture heavier and more permanent than applause could ever have been, the kind of tribute reserved for something that had earned it slowly over years. Rather than in a single dramatic moment, my father's eyes flickered toward the crowd instead of toward me, searching for some foothold that wasn't there anymore. The command that had lived in his posture for 40 years slipped, for the first time in that hall, out of his grip entirely. I stepped forward until I stood a few feet from him, in the space where the weight of every gaze in that room converged, the space he had occupied alone for as long as I could remember. My voice didn't need to rise. It carried on its own, the way it always did when I meant every word of it, the way it had carried over a radio net years earlier with a man bleeding out in the vehicle behind me. "Respect isn't inherited," I said. "It's earned." Sometimes in silence. Sometimes in rooms exactly like this one. Not a single breath in that hall dared to break the stillness that followed. For a moment my father simply stood there, hands still resting on the podium as though it might hold him upright if the rest of the room refused to. Someone near the front, an old man in a wheelchair with a combat infantryman badge pinned crooked to his cardigan, cleared his throat into a closed fist. The sound small and dry in all that silence, and then said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "Walton, you ought to sit down before you fall down." A few people laughed, not unkindly, more out of relief than mockery, the tension in the room finding somewhere small and human to go. My father did not laugh. He gripped the edge of the podium a moment longer, then slowly, as though his knees had only just remembered how old he actually was, he stepped down from the stage without another word, and made his way to a folding chair near the wall, where he sat with his hands folded in his lap, like a man waiting for instructions that were never going to come. Ely found me near the pie table afterward, still visibly shaken, apologizing before I could tell him there was nothing to apologize for. "I didn't know," he said, echoing without realizing it, the exact words my father would say to me at his kitchen table only hours later. I served with men who talked about the architect like she was half legend. I never once thought I'd end up standing next to her father, being told I was the son he never had. He shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Major. I had no idea what I was walking into tonight." "You didn't do anything wrong," I told him, and meant it. "You told the truth. That's all any of us ever owed each other in that hall." The house looked smaller than I remembered it, its paint weathered gray, the porch sagging a little further under another decade of Ohio winters that had come and gone without anyone bothering to reinforce the beams beneath it. Inside, nothing had changed. The smell of coffee and old wood lingered the way it always had, as though time itself had been ordered to stand at attention in that kitchen, and had simply never been given permission to fall out. I sat across from my father at the same table where he'd once drilled me to keep my back straight and my eyes forward, where I'd eaten 1,000 silent breakfasts under his watchful correction. The scarred wood still bore the dark stain of a burn I'd made as a teenager setting down a pot, too hot, too fast, and he'd lectured me for a full hour about carelessness that day, about attention to detail, about the kind of person who let things slip. The mark had never faded, no matter how many times my mother had tried to sand it smooth when he wasn't home. His hand rested there now, trembling slightly, tracing the outline of that old blemish like a man searching for something he'd misplaced years ago and only just noticed, with something like alarm, was gone. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us across that table, but it wasn't the sharp, disciplined silence I'd grown up inside. The kind that demanded stillness and obedience. It was heavier than that, the silence of years wasted, sitting on the table between 2 cups of coffee neither of us had touched, cooling slowly in the afternoon light. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice softer and thinner than I'd ever heard it in my life, eyes fixed on the burn mark rather than on me, unable, even now, to meet my gaze directly. "I expected a son. That was foolish of me." The words landed with a weight I'd spent the better part of 3 decades waiting to hear, a weight I'd almost convinced myself I would never actually feel. It wasn't an apology, not even close, not by any honest measure, but it was the nearest thing to one he had ever managed to produce in his entire life. And after everything sitting there in that too quiet kitchen, I understood it would have to be enough. Because it was all there was. I drew a breath, steady, even, the same way I'd learned to steady my voice over a radio net with a man bleeding out in the vehicle behind me. "I didn't need a son to carry your name," I told him. "I carried my own." The truth sat between us on that table, plain and undeniable, no longer something either of us needed to argue about. No tears, no sudden embrace, just the reality of it spoken aloud finally after decades in which neither of us had found the courage or the humility to say it. And somehow that plainness was its own kind of mercy, quieter and more honest than any grand reconciliation I might have once imagined for us. He let out a long, uneven breath, his shoulders dropping as though some weight he'd carried since the day I was born had finally cracked loose from wherever he'd been storing it all those years. Ugh. His chin dipped low, and for the first time since I'd known him, in any uniform, at any age, he looked small. Just a man. No longer a commander, no longer an unshakable wall of authority I'd spent my whole life trying and failing to scale. His lips parted, and the word that came out was rough, unpolished, like it had never once been shaped in his mouth before that particular afternoon. "Proud," he said. One word. Nothing else, no explanation, no qualification. But it stripped him bare, in a way no salute, no parade, no ceremony ever could have. He wasn't the man who'd ruled my childhood with drills and silence anymore. Not in that moment. He was flawed and diminished and, for the first time in my life, finally honest with me. And that, more than anything I'd ever earned in uniform, more than any medal pinned to my chest by any commanding officer, was the recognition I had stopped believing I would ever hear from him. I drove out of town slowly that evening past the old Legion Hall, past the diner where my mother used to take me for milkshakes on the Saturdays. My father was too busy drilling recruits at the reserve center to notice we'd left, and somewhere along that quiet 2-lane road, with the windows down and the summer air thick with cut hay, a question rose up in me that I hadn't let myself ask before. Not really. Not honestly. Had I spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong? And if I had, was any of it ever really mine? There's a particular kind of trap in spending your entire adult life answering someone else's verdict, even in triumph, even when the triumph is real and earned and documented in official army records. If I had only ever run faster, planned better, held steadier under fire because some part of me was still that 8-year-old standing at attention in the kitchen, waiting for a man who would never quite look at me the way he'd looked at Eli within an hour of meeting him, then had I ever actually been free of him at all? Or had I just built an entire career, an entire identity, an entire self, out of spite dressed up carefully as discipline, so carefully that even I had stopped being able to tell the difference? I thought about the Wadi crossing, about the 9 seconds in that debrief tent, about Reyes's leg, and the letter my mother had copied in secret on a library photocopier, and the silver star sitting now in a certified folder that had nothing at all to do with my father's opinion of me. None of that had ever been for him. Not really, not at its core. It had only ever felt that way because his voice had been loud enough for long enough, since before I could even form full sentences, to drown out every other reason I might have had for becoming who I'd become. Somewhere past the county line with the radio off and nothing but the hum of tires on asphalt for company, I let myself cry for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not from grief exactly. And not from anger either, but from something closer to relief, the particular relief of realizing that the thing you've been fighting for decades had never actually been as large or as permanent as it had always felt from the inside. I wasn't proving anything to him anymore. I hadn't needed to for years, if I was honest with myself. I had simply forgotten, somewhere along the way, buried under deployments and promotions and the slow accumulation of a career, that I was allowed to stop. At my mother's grave, the cemetery lay quiet beneath the spread of old oaks that had probably been standing there since before either of my parents were born, their branches whispering in the warm breath of a late Ohio afternoon. Sunlight filtered gold and soft through the leaves, painting the headstones in a glow that made even that quiet place feel almost merciful, almost gentle, in a way the rest of my life rarely did. I walked the narrow gravel path until I reached her stone-worn, smooth now by years of rain and wind, and rested my palm against the cool granite, feeling its rough edges beneath my fingers. The small, chiseled letters of her name that I'd traced so many times before, my voice came out low, meant only for her, meant for no one else in that quiet place. "We're learning," I said, slow but true. The breeze moved through the oaks just then, stirring the leaves into a soft, continuous whisper, and for one instant I swore I could hear her voice folded somewhere into it, gentle and steady, carrying the words she'd given me at the very end in a hospital room that smelled nothing like our kitchen words I'd kept folded in my chest through 2 deployments and every silence in between. "Don't run away. Rise above." I closed my eyes and let the air move through me, not fighting it, not grasping for it, just receiving it the way she would have wanted me to, the way she'd always received everything quietly, without demanding it be anything other than what it was. When I finally stepped back from the stone, I felt no need for anger anymore, and no hunger for triumph either. Peace, it turned out, was quieter than I had ever imagined it would be. Quieter even than the silence my father had spent his whole life wielding like a weapon. What mattered in the end wasn't my father's collapse in that Legion Hall, or his pride finally spoken decades too late, one word across a kitchen table. It wasn't the whispers that had traveled through that room, or even the standing, silent tribute of men who'd known him for 40 years and had just learned, all at once, who I really was. It was that the truth had stood steady and unshaken in front of everyone who needed to see it. The community. Eli. Even my father, reluctantly, painfully, had been forced at last to face it plainly, across a scarred kitchen table with 2 cups of cold coffee between us. That alone was enough. It had to be, and for the first time, I believed it truly was. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at my apartment with a return address I recognized from 100 old envelopes. Command Sergeant Major Boone, retired now, still ran the Veterans Outreach Program for our old regiment, and his handwriting on the front of the envelope was as square and deliberate as the man himself. Each letter formed with the same precision he'd once demanded of his soldiers. Inside was an invitation, the regiment's annual memorial ceremony, held each spring for the Rangers who hadn't come home, was looking for a guest speaker this year, someone who understood both what had been lost and what had been carried forward in its place. Boone's note at the bottom was short, written in the same blunt, affectionate tone I remembered from every debrief he'd ever run. Figured it was time the architect got to build something out loud, for once, instead of just under fire. Come home and talk to them, Major. They'd listen to you. I read it twice on my apartment steps, and something in my chest loosened that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched tight. Some old tension I'd carried so long, I'd stopped noticing its weight. My whole career, I'd built plans in silence in the dark in the space between one radio transmission and the next, and no one outside those tents had ever heard my voice do anything but give calm, clipped orders under pressure. This would be different. This would be standing in front of a room full of grieving families and proud veterans, not to defend myself, not to prove anything to anyone, not even to my father, but simply to tell the truth about what it costs and what it gives back to be the person who rebuilds the board when everything else falls apart around her. I wrote back the same evening, 3 words, the only answer that had ever really mattered in my life, the only answer I'd ever given that cost me nothing and meant everything. I'll be there. My father called 2 days after I mailed that reply, the first time he'd ever called me first in either direction in over a decade. He cleared his throat twice before he managed to say anything at all. Boone told me about the ceremony, he said finally, asked if I'd want to come sit with the families, said it was my choice. A long pause stretched between us over the line, the kind of silence that used to frighten me and now simply felt like 2 people learning slowly and imperfectly how to occupy the same quiet without it costing either of us anything. I'd like to come, Nora, if that's all right with you. I thought of the kitchen table, the burn mark, the single rough word he'd finally managed to say out loud. I thought of 30 years of silence and of how much shorter that silence had felt once it had finally broken. Come, I told him. Sit wherever you like. Just come. He was quiet a moment longer. Thank you, he said, and for once, he didn't sound like a commander saying it. He sounded like a father. The story didn't end with my father's collapse in that hall, or with the standing tribute of men who'd finally understood who'd been sitting quietly among them all those years. Easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. It ended somewhere quieter than that and somewhere far more solid, with my own 2 feet planted firmly in the place my mother had once promised me I would fly to. Not because I had finally beaten the man who tried for 30 years to convince me I was worthless, but because I had at long last stopped needing his verdict at all and had found in its place my own.